It sounded like one continuous volley, maybe for a whole minute or a little longer, recalled journalist John Kiffner, reporting for the New York Times. The tragedy at Kent State University was the moment the state turned its weapons on its own children. On Monday, May 4th, 1970, around 12:24 p.m., after a long, cold winter, it was a warm, sunny day with variable winds and temperatures around 20 degrees Celsius, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect for a walk. An estimated 1,500 to 3,000 students gathered on the Commons. Some were heading to class, others came for a rally. Over 13 fatal seconds, National Guard soldiers fired 67 bullets into the crowd of unarmed young people. 4 students were killed, and 9 were wounded. This bloody day forever changed America, turning a warm spring afternoon into a national nightmare. On April 30th, President Nixon announced the expansion of the Vietnam War, the invasion of Cambodia. This move was made contrary to his campaign promises to end the conflict, becoming the spark that led to the tragedy. Students felt betrayed and lied to, which triggered a wave of growing disappointment and solidified the anti-war sentiment of the youth, who realized that the government had misled them. The youth considered the anti-war movement their personal fight for peace. Instead of witnessing the war's conclusion, students saw its escalation. Nixon's speech was directly aimed against this movement, which was striving to stop the bloodshed. Rumors spread among activists that the government was planning even greater escalation. False information also circulated, such as untrue plans to withdraw troops from Vietnam within a year, which, nonetheless, made it into newspapers. Young people gathered by their radios and televisions, and their faces showed shock and rage. The war they vowed to stop was now intensifying. The children had sworn to stop the war machine. Now, the machine was accelerating. On Friday, May 1st, protests escalated into riots. 500 students gathered for the rally at noon, and by evening, the number of protesters had grown to up to 2,000. This first genuinely warm night of spring after a long, cold winter led to a large congregation of youth on the Strip. The organizers were a group of history students called WHORE, World Historians Opposed to Racism and Exploitation. The protest, which began as a rally, quickly grew into something more. The windows of 56 stores were broken in total. In response, Mayor Satrom, who was described as inexperienced and prone to conspiracy theories, a psychological profile that contributed to his panicked reaction, declared a state of emergency, closed bars, and imposed a curfew. In this tense atmosphere, rumors circulated. Anonymous sources reported plans to burn down the draft board and the post office, and merchants recounted being threatened with arson if they did not display anti-war slogans. Stranger rumors also spread, such as planned LSD addition to the city's water supply, the construction of tunnels to blow up the main shopping center, and hidden weapon caches. Youth was bustling on the Strip, and the warm May wind carried the scent of change. The noise of music from the bars blended with shouting slogans. The police were in disarray. "They want to burn the whole city," the mayor repeated hysterically into the phone, exaggerating every rumor tenfold, thereby deepening the panic. The night of May 2nd became the moment when the protest escalated into direct action. Students set fire to the ROTC, Reserve Officers Training Corps building, which was a symbol of military encroachment on campus life. Anti-war activists nationwide demanded the removal of ROTC from university grounds. Protesters attempted to set the building on fire several times, until they finally managed to ignite a strong blaze using railroad flares and a gasoline-soaked rag. When firefighters arrived at the scene, they were pelted with rocks and their hoses were cut with pocket knives or torn from their hands. The firefighters were forced to retreat, and the building burned down completely. The National Guard first appeared on campus that night. The mystery of the arsonists was never resolved. They were not arrested. An FBI investigation indicated that a significant portion of those actively involved in the arson were not Kent State students. Based on this, some researchers suggest the fire was pre-planned. Alternative versions and rumors exist. One witness claimed, "We had no real reason to suspect students burned the building, but we are blamed for it. This is one of the myths about burning the ROTC building." Some said that the police and campus security effectively allowed the building to burn. Fire engulfed the building. Tongues of flame licked the night sky, and thousands of students screamed in the acrid smoke. Captain Snyder in a helicopter looking down might have thought, "This is not a sunset. This is not a sunset." Guardsmen stood helplessly, watching the main symbol of military presence in their educational institution crumble into ashes. May 3rd was marked by the deployment of the National Guard, which occupied the campus with 1,000 soldiers. Governor James Rhodes arrived in the city, campaigning for the U.S. Senate as a law and order candidate. His words, delivered at a press conference, were widely perceived as a direct threat and a premonition of the tragedy that occurred the following day. Rhodes did not mince words, calling the protesters the worst type of people and comparing them to Nazis and lynchers. He explicitly stated, "They are worse than the brown shirts, Nazis, and the communist element, and also the night riders and the vigilantes." The governor continued, promising severe action. "We are going to eradicate the problem, and we are going to take every necessary step." His belligerent tone was amplified by General Del Corso's addition, "We will use any degree of force necessary to protect lives." Many researchers view Governor Rhodes' speech as a direct provocation that psychologically prepared the guardsmen for the use of deadly force. Several guardsmen, who later recounted the events, indicated that Rhodes' words gave them confidence that the use of force would be supported by the high command. Thus, Governor Rhodes' speech on May 3rd effectively served as a red flag, foreshadowing the inevitable bloodshed. The governor stood before the microphones. His face was tense, his lips pressed tight. He spoke of enemies, of communists, of Nazis. His words sounded like a verdict. Journalists in the hall wrote down every word, and officers at the military base listened on the radio. One of them slowly nodded. Order must be restored, at any cost, tomorrow. The evening of May 3rd was marked by escalating tension on campus. About 200 students held a peaceful sit-in at the corner of Lincoln and Main Streets, demanding a meeting with the university president. By 8:45 p.m., the National Guard used tear gas to disperse the crowd. At 11 p.m., the Guard announced the implementation of a curfew and began forcing students back into the dormitories, becoming increasingly aggressive in the process. Guardsmen used bayonets to persuade the unarmed young people to disperse. Evidence of brutality emerged. An anonymous guardsman later recounted the events. "We had bayonets, and they didn't. They were running. They were being stabbed. One was stabbed in the arm. The bayonet went through his arm into the building. Another was cut. We had masks on. We were anonymous. We had stripped the name tags off our jackets." This night was a precursor to the tragedy, when the students' idealism first met the cold aggression of military presence. Students sat on the commons. They were young, idealistic, and peaceful. Floodlights turned on. A voice called out, "Disperse, or we will begin to use force." The students did not move, believing in the power of peace. But then came the combat masks and bayonets. Cold metal pricked the skin. The young people cried out and ran. A military night descended upon the campus, and tension reached its peak. The final hours before the tragedy were marked by an apparent calm that sharply contrasted with the tension of the preceding days. The morning of May 4th was ordinary. Students were preparing for classes, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. The university administration, attempting to prevent the planned noon rally, distributed 12,000 flyers announcing the cancellation of the assembly. However, University President Robert White never appeared for a meeting with the students, leaving them without direct contact or an opportunity for dialogue. The weather was perfect for a mass gathering, a warm, sunny day following a long, cold winter. An estimated 1,500 to 3,000 students gathered on the commons, disregarding the administration's attempts to disperse them. A little-known fact is that some students who were later wounded and killed were simply on their way to class that morning, or heard about the rally entirely by chance. The sun was shining. Students hurried to classes, carrying books, talking about homework. A flyer hung on the wall. Assembly canceled. But no one read the flyers. They saw each other. They heard the voices of activists. They were going to the commons. They were going to stand up. They were going to speak out. They did not know that this was their last journey. The drama leading to the tragedy unfolded minute by minute. Starting at 11:30 a.m., students began gathering at the Victory Bell. Around 12 p.m., General Canterbury ordered 113 soldiers to disperse the students. At 12:05 p.m., the Guard used tear gas, but it proved ineffective due to strong winds. The Guardsmen retreated to the football field, then began to return, pursuing students up the hill. The tension was like before a thunderstorm. The general looked at the crowd. A voice through the megaphone called for them to disperse. The students did not leave, singing anti-war songs. At precisely 12:24 p.m., 28 guardsmen suddenly turned and opened fire. This was the decisive moment. The question of a direct order to shoot remains controversial. Officially, the guardsmen claimed there was no order to fire, and the FBI concluded that the guard was not under fire. However, an alternative version exists. In 2007, Alan Canfora discovered a cassette tape recorded by student Terry Struby, on which, according to forensic experts, after enhancement, a command can be heard. They claim to hear, Voice 1, guard. Voice 2, 2 seconds later, right, prepare to fire. And Voice 2, fire. Critics, however, believe the sound may be misinterpreted as natural language noise, and the FBI maintained its conclusion that there was no order. Nevertheless, Jim Spreng recalled, it sounded like one continuous volley, maybe for a whole minute or a little longer. The commander looked ahead. A sunny day. Tension. The guardsmen turned. Rifles were raised. And then, 13 seconds, 67 bullets. History changed. The tragedy of May 4th claimed the lives of 4 young students, each of whom was not just a victim, but a person with their own history, dreams, and ideals. Jeffrey Glenn Miller, 20 years old, an active participant in the demonstration and opponent of the war. He was only 81 meters, 265 feet, from the guardsmen and was the closest casualty. He was shot in the mouth and died instantly. Little known fact, he was directly in front of the guardsmen, fully in their line of sight. Allison Beth Krause, 19 years old, an activist since her freshman year, who helped organize a march against the Vietnam War. She was fatally wounded in the left side of her chest at a distance of 105 meters, 343 feet, and died upon arrival at the hospital. Her death became a symbol of the killing of youth idealism. William Knox Schroeder, 19 years old. The paradox of his death underscores the absurdity of the situation. He was a member of the campus ROTC battalion and was simply walking to class when he was shot by the organization he served. He sustained a fatal chest wound at a distance of 116 meters, 382 feet, and died nearly an hour later at a local hospital during surgery. His death highlights the irony. Combat units opened fire on their own comrade from the same structure. Sandra Lee Scheuer, 20 years old, an honors student in the speech and hearing therapy program. She was not participating in the demonstration, but was merely walking to class with her student. She was shot in the neck at a distance of 120 meters, 390 feet, and died within minutes from blood loss. Her significance lies in the fact that she was simply a student who chose the wrong time and place. Little known fact, Sandra was a friend of Marianne Vecchio, the girl in the famous photograph. 4 lives were cut short in an instant, leaving behind eternal pain and unresolved questions. 9 students survived the shooting, but were permanently left with physical and psychological injuries. Dean Kaler, a 19-year-old freshman, was shot in the back with fractured vertebrae at a distance of 79 meters, 258 feet, observing from the far end of the parking lot. He was left permanently paralyzed below the waist, becoming a symbol of the incurable wounds, but continued to be an active voice for justice. Alan Canfora, 69 meters, one of the most active May 4th activists, was wounded in the right wrist. He spent decades investigating and documenting the events, and in 2007, discovered the cassette with a possible order to fire. Joseph Lewis Jr., 22 meters, was shot twice in the abdomen and leg while standing with his middle finger raised. John R. Cleary, 34 meters, was wounded in the chest. Thomas Mark Grace, 69 meters, had a bullet tear off most of his left foot. Although doctors wanted to amputate, his mother saved the limb. Douglas Allen Rentmore was wounded in the knee, 100 meters, and James Russell was shot in the thigh and forehead, 114 meters. The farthest wounded person, Robert Stamps, was shot in the buttock at a distance of 152 meters. Donald C. McKenzie was wounded in the neck and cheek, with the bullet passing half an inch from his spine. All of them experienced pain that will live on forever. The perception of the tragedy was changed by a single photograph. Student photojournalist John Philo was on the scene with his Nickermat camera and Tri-X film. Philo initially thought the guard was using blank rounds and ran closer to shoot. It was then that he captured the moment that became the symbol of the day. 14-year-old Marianne Vecchio, a runaway, fell to her knees near the dead body of a student, just 3 meters away from Philo. In 1971, Philo won the Pulitzer Prize for the image. The girl in the photograph, Marianne Vecchio, was friends with the slain Sandra Scheuer and the wounded Alan Canfora. A strange story involves the photo's retouching. In the early 1970s, an anonymous editor retouched the image, removing a fence post that was above Vecchio's head. The altered version circulated in major publications such as Time and People, and the question of who decided to alter the historical image and why remained unanswered. 25 years later, in 1995, Philo and Vecchio met at a seminar. When they recognized each other, they embraced and wept. This moment became a symbol of the reunion of two lives, forever linked by a single photograph, a single click that became an eternity. The shooting occurred precisely at 12:24 p.m. In just 13 seconds, 28 out of more than 70 guardsmen fired approximately 67 rounds. Sergeant Myron Pryor allegedly was the first to turn and begin firing his .45 caliber pistol. Technical facts indicate that many guardsmen fired into the air or the ground, but some aimed directly at the crowd. The most controversial point remains the question of an order. The official version states that the guardsmen claimed there was no order to fire. The FBI concluded that the guard was not under fire and that the guardsmen fired first. However, the 2007 alternative version, based on a cassette recorded by student Terry Strub and discovered by Alan Canfora, suggests a different scenario. Forensics experts working with the enhanced recording claim to hear clear commands: guard. Then, 2 seconds later, right, prepare to fire, and fire. Critics, however, believe the sound may be misinterpreted as natural language noise, and the FBI has not changed its conclusion. Nevertheless, Governor Rhodes' words about any necessary force created a psychological climate for the use of weapons. The guardsmen, claiming to be frightened by being pelted with rocks, were on edge. The hill, the sun, guardsmen up top, students below. One commander looks down. The face of a young man below, shouting words of protest, meets his gaze. An instant, a decision. Rifles were raised, and then the sound of shots, like burning rain. 13 seconds, 67 bullets, 4 lives, 9 wounded. History. Among those in the square on the fateful day was 14-year-old Marianne Vecchio. She was not a student and was not participating in the demonstration. She was a girl who had run away from home. Her presence in the square remains one of the day's mysteries. She was there at the wrong time and in the wrong place. Despite her young age, Marianne was acquainted with some of the casualties. She was a friend of the slain Sandra Scheuer and the wounded Alan Canfora. When the shooting began, Marianne was close to the tragedy. She was captured in the day's most famous photograph by student photojournalist John Philo. She dropped to her knees near the body of Jeffrey Miller, and her face, contorted in pain and the silent scream, became known worldwide. A quarter of a century later, in 1995, Marianne Vecchio and John Philo met at a seminar at a Boston college. They recognized each other, embraced, and wept. This moment of reunion for two lives linked by a single photograph became a symbolic closure to their personal tragedy. Immediately after the shooting, an absolute silence descended, followed by screams, wails, and chaos. The frightened guardsmen retreated to the commons, finding themselves face to face with a large and hostile crowd of students who had fully realized the scale of the tragedy that had occurred. The crowd was on the verge of attacking the guardsmen, which would have led to a second, potentially even greater massacre. Many students were physically preparing to assault the guardsmen, and there can be no doubt that the guard would have opened fire again, this time resulting in a much higher death toll. The hero of the day was Glenn Frank, a geology professor who led the faculty marshals. Frank successfully persuaded the students not to attack the guard, thereby preventing a potentially even greater tragedy. In this critical moment, University President Robert White ordered the university to close. The Commons was evacuated, and the university remained closed for about 6 weeks. The sounds of gunfire faded, and the smoke dispersed. The students' faces turned into masks of fury and pain. They moved forward, ready to attack. The guardsmen raised their rifles. Another 13 seconds, and there would have been a second massacre. But then the professor appeared, tall, gray-haired, with raised hands. His voice sounded like a prayer. "Please, please go back. Don't do this. Please." The students stopped. Tears streamed down their faces. The professor saved their lives that day. The Kent State University shooting provoked the largest student strike in U.S. history. Student protests reached their peak on May 5th. By May 6th, 536 campuses were completely closed, and 51 remained closed until the end of the year. On May 8th, 100,000 protesters gathered in Washington, and 150,000 in San Francisco. Over 900 campuses in all states except Alaska participated in the strike, leading to the cancellation or optional status of exams at many universities. The aftermath also manifested in increased violence. About 30 ROTC buildings were bombed or set on fire nationwide. The National Guard was deployed to 21 campuses across 16 states. The events at Kent became the world's #1 news story, sparking solidarity protests in other countries. Just 11 days after the events at Kent State University, on the night of May 14th to 15th, 1970, another tragedy occurred that largely went forgotten at Jackson State College, now university. A predominantly African-American institution in Mississippi, state police opened fire on students. The shooting lasted 28 seconds, during which approximately 400 bullets were fired. As a result, 2 students, Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green, were killed, and 12 people were wounded. The target was a women's dormitory. The Jackson State tragedy was largely ignored and forgotten for several reasons. The victims were black, while American society showed more sympathy toward white students. The event occurred just 2 weeks after Kent State, which reduced mass media attention. Racial prejudices undoubtedly influenced public memory. The historical significance of Jackson State is that it demonstrates that the Kent State shooting was not the only instance where American authorities used deadly force against students. The Kent State University tragedy became the direct inspiration for one of the most famous anti-war songs in music history. Neil Young wrote "Ohio" in May 1970, just a few days after the shooting, when he and David Crosby were staying at a house near San Francisco. The song was written in just 15 minutes. Young heard reports of the shooting, sat down, and wrote the lyrics that burst from his throat like blood from a wound. The recording took place on May 21st, 1970, in Los Angeles with the group Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, in just 5 takes, with no overdubs. David Crosby cried when they finished. The song's lyrics open with lines about soldiers who opened fire on students. The bold mention of Nixon's name was revolutionary. The chorus, "4 dead in Ohio," sounded like a cry of pain, and the line, "How can we know where to go or what to do?" conveyed the generation's confusion. The single was released in early June 1970 in an envelope with a copy of the Constitution featuring 4 bullet holes. However, several AM radio stations, including in the state of Ohio, banned the song because of the mention of Nixon. Despite the bans, the song reached number 14 on the charts in August. David Crosby called Young's decision to keep Nixon's name in the lyrics the bravest thing I ever heard, and later added that it was one of the most important songs I've ever been involved with. The music became a weapon against the war, and the song, a prayer and an anthem for the generation. In response to the national uproar caused by the tragedy, President Richard Nixon appointed the Scranton Commission, chaired by former Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton. The commission's purpose was to investigate campus unrest across the United States. In September 1970, the commission released its report. The main conclusion was that the shooting was unjustified. The commission unequivocally concluded the shooting was unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable. The report explicitly stated that, even if the guardsmen faced danger, it was not a danger requiring the use of deadly force. 61 shots fired by 28 guardsmen cannot be justified. The significance of this report was immense. It was an official governmental acknowledgement that the shooting was a crime, and that the actions of the guardsmen were wrong and disproportionate to the situation. However, despite these findings, no criminal charges were brought against the guardsmen. The path to justice proved long and difficult. Initially, in October 1970, the Ohio grand jury indicted 24 students and 1 professor, the so-called Kent 25, primarily for the burning of the ROTC building. However, the same jury did not charge any guardsmen, legally justifying that they fired their weapons in honest and sincere belief that they would otherwise suffer serious bodily injury. In 1973, a federal grand jury did indict 8 guardsmen, but in 1974, federal judge Frank J. Battisti dismissed all charges, ruling that the guardsmen were entitled to act as they did. The families of the deceased and the wounded filed a civil lawsuit for $46 million, 13 separate cases. In the summer of 1975, after a 15-week trial, the jury voted 10-2 in favor of all defendants, to which the plaintiffs shouted, "Murderers!" In 1977, the Court of Appeals unanimously overturned this ruling, finding that the federal judge had improperly handled a threat to a juror, and the case was sent back for retrial. Instead of a retrial, an out-of-court settlement was reached on January 4, 1979, for $675,000 for all plaintiffs, plus $75,000 for attorney fees and expenses. The defendants, including Governor James Rhodes and 27 guardsmen, signed a statement of regret, which read, "Deeply regretting the deaths of 4 students and the wounding of 9 others, we hope that the agreement to end this litigation will help to mitigate the tragic memories concerning that sad day." The plaintiff's attorney called it a great victory, though General Sylvester Del Corso insisted, "There is no apology. We express sorrow and regret exactly as you express condolences to the family of one who has died." The May 4th tragedy is surrounded by rumors, conspiracy theories, and unresolved questions. One of the main mysteries is the role of Terry Norman, a former student and FBI informant working under the COINTELPRO program, whose goal was to neutralize anti-war organizations. 3 witnesses reported hearing either Norman confess, "I should have shot," or a detective's exclamation. Despite this, the FBI claimed Norman's pistol never fired, but questions about his role remain. Editor James Renner suggested Norman may have been hired by the FBI to instigate instability. Also, despite official conclusions, the sniper theory resurfaces. Director Oliver Stone revived this theory in 2015, although it had long been disproved, and Alan Canfora condemned it as a distraction. The official FBI conclusion remains unchanged. The guard was not under sniper fire. The guardsman fired first. The identity of the ROTC building arsonists is still unknown. The FBI concluded that a significant portion of those actively involved in the arson were not Kent State students, leading to speculation of a pre-planned fire. Some claimed that the police and campus security effectively allowed the building to burn. Among the little-known facts, Chrissy Hind of the Pretenders attended the art school at Kent State University and was present on May 4, 1970. She heard the shots and knew that Jeffrey Miller, one of the victims, was the boyfriend of one of her friends. Also, John Philo's famous photograph was retouched in the early 1970s. A fence post was removed, and who did it remains a mystery. The geography of the tragedy showed that victims were at a significant distance from the guardsmen, ranging from 22 to 152 meters, emphasizing that they could not have posed an immediate threat. The Kent State University shooting remains one of the most divisive moments in U.S. history, marking the day America turned weapons on its own children. This shocking event is deeply etched into the national memory. The lessons of the tragedy are relevant even today, touching upon discussions about military intervention in domestic protests and citizens' rights to peaceful assembly and protest. The events of May 4th serve as a warning about the danger of escalation when authorities and civil society clash. Every time mass protests erupt, people remember Kent, and contemporary human rights defenders refer to May 4th as a cautionary tale. The symbolism of what happened remains powerful. In 13 seconds, soldiers fired 67 bullets at unarmed students. 4 were killed, 9 were wounded, and some were merely on their way to class. It is a potent reminder of the cost of dissent. Important historical note. According to a Gallup poll taken a week after the incident, 58% of respondents blamed the students, 11% blamed the National Guard, and 31% had no opinion. This statistic shows how divided American society was at that time. People gather on the Kent State University Commons every May 4th. They lay flowers, observe silence, and remember the 4 who never returned from class. They ask themselves, could this happen again? Authorities, fearful, use force. Youth, dreaming of peace, resist. Kent remains a warning that America should not forget. The tragedy at Kent State University remains an open wound in American history. Every year on May 4th, thousands of people gather on campus to honor the memory of the dead. Flowers are laid at the spot where the 4 students were killed. In their memory, the words of Edwin Starr resonate. War, what is it good for? The legacy of the survivors endures. Dean Kaler, despite his paralysis, remained an activist. Alan Canfora dedicated decades to research and the search for truth. Even after the death of John Cleary in November 2025, his memory will be preserved. The symbolism of the site is maintained by the memory marker and the May 4th Visitors Center, which serve as a reminder of what happened, making the campus a place of pilgrimage for those who want to understand American history. Questions, however, remain. Was justice served? No, the guardsmen escaped criminal liability. Was it acknowledged that evil occurred? Yes, the Scranton Commission recognized it. Has the world changed? Marginally. Every May, students bring flowers. Every May, memories are awakened. Jeffrey, Allison, William, and Sandra are eternal in our memory. They were 20, 19, 19, and 20 years old. They wanted peace. They dreamed of a world without war. Instead, they received bullets. Instead, they received death. But their death was not in vain. It awakens the conscience of the nation. It says, remember what happened, and do not let it happen again.